If Switzerland is known for one thing, it's their commitment to neutrality. In the landlocked, mountain-inundated European country is somewhat obsessed with preserving this reputation. Switzerland has not taken part in an armed conflict in over 200 years. They refuse to make any sort of alliances or join any multilateral organizations, going so far as to abstain from UN membership until 2002. That's how neutral Switzerland is. Such a strong commitment to this principle demands an investigation of how Switzerland got to this place. I will attempt to answer how and when Switzerland became a neutral country. In modern geopolitical terms, a country being neutral usually implies a conscious foreign policy decision being made by its government. And yet, throughout most of Swiss history, such a state able to enact such policies did not exist. The Swiss people instead existed as a decentralized confederacy composed of cantons, beginning in 1291 when the cantons of Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden signed a defensive alliance to protect against the encroaching power of the Austrian Habsburgs. Gradually, the Habsburgs' influence began to wane in Switzerland, prompting more cantons to join the confederacy. At first, this Swiss confederacy was more of a loosely organized alliance network than a coherent political entity. Individual cantons had their own territorial ambitions, alliances, and trade partners. These tensions erupted into an armed conflict in the early modern period when several Swiss cantons fought on opposing sides of the Burgundian War. At the war's conclusion in 1481, the Confederacy sought to prevent a similarly destructive conflict from happening again, outlawing war between individual cantons at the Diet of Stans. While the cantons remained largely autonomous in other matters, this Diet was the beginning of an eventual movement towards a unified Switzerland. Though the treaty was successful in momentarily ending infighting between the cantons, the Confederacy remained involved in international conflicts. Swiss soldiers had gained a reputation of being competent infantrymen during the Burgundian War, so the great powers of Europe began to seek their employment as mercenaries. Their influence was especially noteworthy during the Italian War, a conflict the Habsburgs and the French fought for dominion over northern Italy. The southern cantons entered the war on the side of the Habsburgs after being promised territorial gains. Though they were ultimately defeated, France did not impose any terms on the defeated cantons and allowed the Confederacy to return to its status quo. So while conflict between the Swiss cantons for the most part ceased during this period, the Confederacy was by no means a neutral party in the many wars fought between the great powers of Europe. This brief period of internal unity was soon upheaved by the Protestant Reformation. Like so many other states in Europe, internal divisions emerged when some cantons elected to convert to a Protestant sect, while others chose to remain Catholic. At first, civil war between the Protestant and Catholic cantons was avoided. The two sides negotiated at the Tagsatzung and reached an agreement for religious peace within the Confederacy. These terms were mostly favorable to the Protestants, however, as the Catholic cantons were forced to dissolve their alliance with the powerful Habsburgs. With both sides feeling dissatisfied, tensions continued to build. In 1531, fighting broke out between the Catholic and Protestant sides. The Protestants were decisively defeated, with the influential Protestant reformer Huldrych Zwingli being among the slain. The Catholics established a favorable status quo after the war, one which would endure for 2 centuries. Catholicism became the favored religion and was awarded proportionally more representation at the Tagsatzung. Protestantism remained a tolerated religion within the Confederacy, but they had considerably less power than they enjoyed before the war. Peace within the Confederacy persisted, as it managed to remain neutral during the Schmalkaldic War, the first major international religious conflict in Europe. But this apparent policy of neutrality did not emerge from the Swiss having some moralistic attitude towards war. Rather, the Confederacy did not enter the conflict because it could not unanimously decide on which side to aid. Logically, the Catholic cantons had no interest in joining the Protestant Schmalkaldic League, and likewise the Protestant cantons did not want to support the Catholic Habsburgs. This explains why there was no collective intervention by the Swiss during the conflict, but what prevented individual cantons from intervening on their own? While many cantons weighed this option, the risk of reigniting religious civil war within the Confederacy was seen as too great, so no action was taken. This tense status quo persisted even after the war's conclusion, with Switzerland remaining disengaged from the subsequent wars of religion that happened during the remainder of the 16th century. A coherent foreign policy could never be agreed upon, so no foreign policy became the default action. Becoming neutral was never a conscious decision made by the Swiss. Throughout the conflicts of history, many nations claimed their neutrality, but hardly ever was their choice respected by the belligerents involved. So for Switzerland's case, why didn't the French, Germans, or Italians take advantage of Switzerland during its period of internal disunity? To first examine France, it is necessary to revisit the Italian Wars. Though several Swiss cantons fought against France during this conflict, no ill will between the Confederacy and the French persisted after its conclusion, and trade began to flourish between Switzerland and France. Even discounting the economic incentives France had to maintain peace, it's not obvious that France would have been able to conquer Switzerland if it had wanted to. France already had enough problems as it was. Each king of France spent most of their reign contending with powerful nobles, encountering their resistance in every step they took to centralize royal authority. To compound matters, France was embroiled in its own war of religion. If France did indeed have hopes of incorporating Switzerland into its realm, such plans would have to wait. As for the Austrian Habsburgs, all desire to conquer Switzerland was left on the shores of Lake Constance, when the Austrian army was decisively defeated there by the Swiss in the Swabian War of 1499. And with the Reformation starting in the Holy Roman Empire shortly afterwards, the Habsburgs had more pressing matters to attend to. Finally, a threat to Switzerland's independence emerging from its southern flank was the least likely possibility. The few Italian states that weren't already vassals of the Habsburgs or the French were more interested in maintaining their own independence than extinguishing Switzerland's. So if Switzerland too internally divided to consider waging war, and with other powers too distracted to care, Swiss neutrality was allowed to become the status quo. This neutrality was tested in its adolescence during the 30 Years' War, a conflict that not even Switzerland would be spared from. Though internal religious tensions still prevented a unanimous Swiss entry into the war, not all cantons managed to avoid the conflict. Most notably, the southern canton of Graubünden got involved after the Habsburgs lured them into the conflict by intervening in a local religious quarrel. The Habsburgs were interested in securing a strategically important mountain pass that went through Graubünden, so when the Catholics of the canton revolted against their Protestant leaders, the Habsburgs promptly came over to the aid of the Catholic side. Fortunately for the Confederacy, this conflict did not spill over into the rest of Switzerland. The other cantons remained neutral during the 30 Years' War, for the same reasons they remained neutral during the Schmalkaldic War. When the war was ended at Westphalia, the peace terms included Switzerland, despite the fact that the Swiss Confederacy never formally participated in the war. Switzerland was primarily affected in two ways. First, Switzerland was absolved of its fealty to the Holy Roman Emperor, becoming an independent state. Second, Switzerland was legally recognized by the signatories of the treaty as a neutral party in European affairs. The policy that had emerged almost entirely on accident was now officially recognized as international law. Following the treaty, Switzerland was successful in remaining disengaged from European affairs. However, in the war's immediate aftermath, it remained troubled by internal religious conflicts. These tensions, which had at this point plagued Switzerland for more than 2 centuries, were finally resolved in 1712, when the Protestants decisively defeated the Catholics in a civil war that lasted only 3 months. So with the return of religious peace within the Confederacy, its growth and development accelerated, becoming one of the most prosperous states in Europe. But the old forces of Europe were starting to give way to a new order, and Switzerland inevitably faced a new threat to its independence and neutrality. Though Switzerland had relatively republican values for its time, they were nevertheless another victim of Napoleon's France and the spread of his revolution. Switzerland was invaded and conquered in 1798. Napoleon promptly dissolved the Swiss Confederacy and established the Helvetic Republic in its place, a centralized republic that systematically overthrew the political status quo of the old Confederacy. This, of course, introduced unparalleled instability to the country, and after a series of revolts, the Helvetic experiment was quickly ended by Napoleon in 1803. He allowed for the Swiss Confederacy to be re-established, reorganizing it to include new cantons as members. While the Helvetic Republic had essentially been a puppet state of Napoleon, this new confederacy was granted significantly more autonomy. However, they willingly chose to remain aligned with France during the remainder of the Napoleonic Wars, all the way until Napoleon was ultimately defeated. Though Switzerland's participation in the Napoleonic Wars marked a brief interlude in the nation's history of neutrality, when the war was ended at the Congress of Vienna, Switzerland renewed its commitment to the principle. During the period of reform that followed the wars, the Swiss identity was in a constant flux, but its central value of neutrality did not waver. Not even the revolutions of 1848, the Franco-Prussian War, or the unification of Italy would change that. Even the world wars could not threaten the neutrality of Switzerland. Many excellent videos have already been produced on the subject, so at the risk of being redundant, I'll cover this period very briefly. With the increasing militarism of the great powers of Europe, it became apparent to Switzerland that legal documents alone were insufficient for the nation to maintain its neutrality. To rectify this, the Swiss pursued a policy of armed neutrality, erecting fortifications and training a competent militia to make an invasion too costly for any hostile power to consider. This strategy proved to be effective, as Switzerland remained neutral through both world wars, while other so-called neutral countries would not be so lucky. So, how, when, and why did Switzerland become neutral? This is the question that this video sought to answer. In brief, there never really was a specific moment or decision that caused neutrality to become intrinsic to the Swiss identity. Neutrality arose when internal divisions made any other policy impossible to pursue. De facto neutrality gradually evolved into a conscious decision, which in turn became an integral part of the Swiss identity. Finally, by using the mountains as a natural fortress and training a formidable defense force, Switzerland was able to solidify its independence as a neutral state. As the geopolitical world uncompromisingly advances into new uncertainty, Switzerland must once again reconsider its position in the world. Can the policy that allowed Switzerland to be an oasis of peace and prosperity continue unflustered, or will it be necessary to engage in world politics once more? Only the Swiss will know.